Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. I hope that you'll be able to hear me because there isn't the room PA. And this is my husband, Jerome. He'll be doing a lot of this with me. Since you are a historical society, well, first, I think I'll give you a little background. It has been 25 years or more now since I've been collecting dolls. We have that white Victorian up the street, and we were antiquing for a sink, literally a bathroom sink, when I saw an antique doll in a wicker stroller. And I thought, wouldn't that be a nice decorated touch, like this original idea? And we didn't buy it because we were convinced it was a reproduction by the woman's son. We stopped at a basket shop on the way where they used to sell these wicker things and learned that it was almost twice the money that she was asking. So I began to see that this was a whole field. Of course, I regretted not having bought the wicker carriage that now I would have to pay twice as much for to buy new as old. And the whole thing was very curious to me. So we went back a while later and we bought the carriage and we bought a doll and then we bought another doll, and we very early on realized that we didn't have the money to do this. We were trying to rebuild this house. And so Jerome said, when you go to this auction, don't buy a doll, buy 5 of them. I thought he'd lost his mind. But he said, you're talented, you can fix them up and you can put them in a friend's shop and sell them, and then you'll own the one that you want to keep for nothing or close to it. Well, that seemed like a good idea, and that was it. I haven't looked back. He has been pushing and prodding me all along. He was the one who found the first collection, and that got us really into the act of buying and selling. In the process, we had to learn a lot. And sometimes I think that I knew more back then when you're first into the dolls, because it's like anything else, the more you learn, the more you realize there is to know. A few years into the collecting, I really found that I liked the French bisque. Their soulful faces just talked to me. And we began traveling to France. At that point, the dollar was very strong against the franc, and you could walk into a shop blindfold. It didn't matter what you bought. It was a matter of how best to spend the money. You couldn't not buy well when the dollar was like 10 francs for $1. And so that was great. That was the high spot of buying. And from there, I got involved with the Steiner dolls that I particularly liked, and I ended up writing a book. And that was great. Shortly after that, I was asked to author a series of books for the Strong Museum. That was not as great, because the one I did on my own out of love, the Strong Museum, the constraints were a little bit more difficult, and I spent a lot of time. And since you're a historical group, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of the historical background that I had worked up for them. Dolls date back to the ancient times. There are records of dolls in graves. We don't really know if they were toys. A lot of other scholars have said that they were there to accompany the departed on his trip to the unknown. But there are also drawings and all that do show dolls as playthings. It's been said that approaching adulthood, girls would leave their dolls at the Temple of Artemis as a symbol of growing up. And even the Bible records that now that I've become a man, I have put away the things of childhood. But for us doll collectors, that doesn't count. We can keep our things of childhood. Some of the first dolls on the American continent were the Kachinas. And again, they have the religious significance tied in with education. Some of the earlier idols, the talismans, the wooden religious symbols were revered themselves as idols, but the Kachinas kind of they transpired into both worlds. They were, yeah, they were educational and entertaining. A child was allowed to hold this, to learn more about their religion and the spirits and their beliefs, but they were allowed also to play with it. And that's an important difference, because the figures that were idols, you could not. And then, of course, I'm sure generations beyond, when you had no idea who the person they represented was, then they would be used for firewood. But the word doll, I think, is intriguing because many different cultures have had lots of different words. One that I particularly liked was the French is poupée, and there's also pupa, and it's the same root, and it's also from the pupil of the eye. And then that is a kind of a reflection of the child in the eye of the teacher. And so you have that learning, reflecting, and the doll reflects man. So I'm not, again, there's great debate as to what the actual root. Does it come from the word idol, or does it come from this poupée, meaning puppet or baby? In England, the word used was always baby. And it's only in this country and after this Revolutionary War that we begin to use the word doll. The babies were out with bathwater. By the and I don't have a picture of this to show you. I do have a copy of my book. Jerome, if you want to take a copy of the American book, this is the go to page 8, and you can kind of walk it around. There are two drawings there, one done by John White, a member of the Roanoke expedition in 1585, and then about 10 years later, 15 years later, Theodore Debris in England had a more anglified version of this drawing, and it shows an Indian child, and the inscription is a Chief Heroah's wife of Pomioc and her daughter, and she's holding a little wooden doll, an English doll. Now, scholars have said that this represents English culture and power, and that the doll was symbolic of the civilized culture. Another writer has referred to it as the weapons of friendship. Touching phrase to me, because it's a simple doll, and in the first picture you'll see the child is very happy. In the English version, the child is waving a silver rattle, very flag-like, and much more symbolic of that power that this doll perhaps represents to the conquering English in this country. Early society in our country, there was no real childhood as we know it. The whole thing of life was to survive, and about half of the children didn't make it to age 5 in the 17th century. And the purpose for the bulk of the people was to get to adulthood. And so you'll see children dressed as miniature adults. You'll see the dolls reflecting this. There was always the wealthier class, of course, that did have a little bit more leisure. And you will find dolls for these families. The bulk of the dolls from that period don't exist. More of them actually do exist in England and in Europe because of the noble families there. But Jerome, if you could show them the English wooden, which is the earliest doll that I have with us here. She came with a little tag on her that says it was found on the body of a French soldier at the Battle of Waterloo. That would be in 1815. But while this is an English doll, you have to remember that since most of the people in this country were imported in that time, so too were the dolls. We did not have a doll industry in this country. We barely had a country. We had exploration, we had expansion, but we certainly didn't have, we had homemade dolls. But at this point in time, the dolls that people brought with them were the dolls in America, or the dolls that a mother made out of whatever materials were around. By the 18th century, you'll find more expansion to the west, and you find more indigenous, more materials being used, and we become aware of the Indian dolls, Native American. They have a big thing there. The Indians tend to call themselves Indians when I've asked them, but others tend to call them Native American. So I had to go through my book at the Strong Museum and change every reference to Native American. This does not work.
Politically correct.
Yes. And I had to take out the Dartmouth anthem, actually more a drinking song, about going into the wilderness to teach the Yin Diane with a gratis ad panasum, a Bible, and a drum, and 500 gallons of New England rum. But I can't because that was derogatory. But it was also reflective of the time. And again, the dolls do reflect. We have, would you show them the Indian doll, please, Jerome?
No, it's a very late.
It's a very late example, but it is typical of the kind of dolls for centuries that the Indians had made. And Indian children were allowed to play with the dolls. Doll play was a very important part. Later, we see, and the fascination, of course, with the Indian and the Indian way of life is reflected in American-made dolls. As I did the book, in every material I tried to incorporate a doll of a Native American. And it was easy. The Strong Museum has the largest collection of dolls in the world, so it was easy to find a doll in every material reflecting of an Indian. But the leather is one of the Jerome, is there, can you get me a water? I think there is water down there. Could you get me a glass of water? Okay, somebody is. Okay, so when do we start seeing dolls that are really made in this country? I'd say the 19th century, and not until then. That's the period where the country itself was expanding. There was more self-sufficiency, becoming less reliant on imported goods, or trying to be. And yet the homemade doll from the 19th century, the early and all the way through the entire 19th century, is really the doll of the American people. Thank you. Yep. Honey, would you show them a couple of the cloth dolls? The early the black rag is an example of, oh, and there's the whole box that I didn't unwrap. The homemade dolls reflect a wide variety of skills. Needle skills were very important. Part of a girl's education from colonial times forward involved needle skills, needle and the arts. That's how they would achieve a good marriage. But it was a very important thing. In fact, I think it was a Boston newspaper that had a listing of all of the skin. It was wonderful. All of the various needle skills that a young girl was expected to learn. That's if she wasn't of the tilling the wood, the soil variety. From there, we begin to see, all right, we had a lot of Germans who immigrated to this country. And from them, we find a lot of the American doll roots. Philadelphia was one of the places that the Germans particularly settled, the Pennsylvania Dutch, as it were. And the very first patent that was taken out in America for a doll was a German man who had come to this country, Ludwig Greiner. And his patent was for a production technique or materials in making papier-mâché heads for dolls. It's probably the same materials that were used in his native Germany, and this is the material that had been used primarily in that period in Germany, and these were some of the dolls that were then imported to this country. Did we unpack any of the milliners? We unpacked as far as we had room for. There is a very heavyweight papier-mâché. Actually, no, I should have had a better papier-mâché example out. If you want to go poking through the boxes, or after the program, I can show you an example of a very nice papier-mâché of the type that was imported from Germany. And these were the kind of dolls that were then made in this country from the middle century. We were still importing dolls, and a lot of the dolls at that time were China. The lady in the green outfit, Jerome, is what's considered China. It's porcelain. Again, the German companies were big porcelain manufacturers. And so a very small part of their production would be dolls. But they would make these doll heads, and the heads alone could be shipped to this country or to other countries, and then the bodies made here. So you only had to pay the import or the shipping on a small portion of the doll. And so you find an industry building up in this country of doll bodies, and lots of patents being made, patented and sold, of cloth bodies or stuffed leather bodies. And then you would go to the hardware store or the import store, buy your head and put it on. So it was sort of half and half, an imported head on a homemade or a commercial American-made body. So you begin to find a kind of combination period there. The bisque dolls were also being imported into this country, and bisque is the same material as China, but it's unglazed. It has a finish that's much more like skin. It's, can you show them? Well, the doll's up close.
Well, this one's interesting because it has an American commercial body, Goldsmith body, which was patented by an American woman.
Man.
Oh, Philip Goldsmith.
And those hands are a patent alone, Lockman actually. I don't think the whole body is Goldsmith. The Lockman hand is a China hand attached, and he took out a patent to attach those little China hands to a cloth body. The person would buy the head and would dress it at home. You notice the skill involved in the costuming of that doll is very professional, and yet it's very likely that it was done at home. A wealthy family, probably the seamstress in the home. In the middle of the 19th century, there were a few inventions that were very important. The sewing machine, which enabled women to, at home, sew and make even the clothes for the dolls, and the seamstress to have perhaps a little more time to dress it. You have photography, which has been wonderful as far as recording what dolls people played with, because photographs do exist, and you see pictures. You see pictures of Indian children playing with American dolls, American children playing with Indian dolls, both ways.
Native Americans.
Yeah, Native Americans. One of the dolls that was brought in here is very similar to the doll in the polka dot dress. Yeah. It's very similar. It's on a cloth or perhaps a homemade or an American-made body, and it's a Jumeau head from France from the 1870s or 80s, and the body is appropriate. It could well have been, it looks like it may have been dressed at home, and it was played with. A lot of these dolls were not. They were considered the Sunday dolls if it was the best doll. In fact, even my daughter, when she grew up, had kind of the best doll that was placed on a shelf. She didn't really get to play with that. So that existed back then too, of course, if there was a lot of money invested. That's a very nice doll. I didn't examine the head. If it's in good condition, it's a very desirable doll. It's a specific look, and we call it that face, because it's that expression with the little turned up corners of the lips, the mustachy kind of mouth with the turned up edges. It's really a very, very fine doll. Back in the middle of the 19th century, the French dolls were the premier dolls, the golden age of the French doll. The French couturier, French costuming was very significant. They were the costume leaders of the country. So naturally, their dolls are going to reflect that. It's been said that these lady dolls were sent out as examples of costume for people to copy. It was not their primary purpose. They were primarily toys and dolls, but there's no doubt that these dolls served that purpose. With the Industrial Revolution, people had more time, they had more money, the grand tours of Europe were happening, and what better to take back than a little doll You ostensibly bring it back for your child, but you're also, as a mother, bringing it back for yourself because it reflects what you've seen. It reflects the culture, the fashion, everything you've been exposed to. It's small, so it travels well, and maybe when you get home you can have that wonderful dress copied. American costuming was at least a year behind what was happening in France, and so you'd be right up to the minute or even ahead of it. There are notations that milliners' models and fashion dolls that were in a window did just that, and then those dolls would be sold off when a new model came in. And so some lucky person would have them to play with. But there is another doll over there, a French fashion, that somebody brought in. And it's just amazing to me that these things are still appearing. It's a wood-bodied Brou. Two of the most notable manufacturers in France are Brou and Jumeau. Who brought this one? You? For somebody, what, 130 years old, she does have good articulation. A very fine doll. I really appreciate you bringing them in. About 1870, and France was still the leader in the manufacturing of dolls, the most desirable dolls. The idea of a doll to represent a child. Now, this is because, of course, the child at that point in time is being seen as more a being. A century before, the child was looked upon as the adult it would someday become. It was dressed as a miniature adult. Childhood itself was not looked on as a special stage. We don't, you know, I just read an article somewhere that the word teenager didn't really even come into being until about 1940. But the basic period of childhood began to see its prime in the Victorian period. A century before, the baby is dressed, the long dresses covering their feet, the barefoot baby that couldn't walk. This was something not to be proud of. By 1870, we have these beautiful Victorian carriages that are facing outward, and there's the baby placed in the carriage as the pride and joy, the showplace of the family. This is their great accomplishment. This is how far the child has come in a century. And you can see it reflected, I think, beautifully in baby carriages. The first ones are pulled along like a cart behind you, and the kid's in it. And then to this point of the Victorian, where the baby has faced forward. It's not until the 20th century that the body of the carriage turns around so the baby is facing the parent, acknowledging that interaction between the parent and the child, the psychological. It's interesting to me because it reflects society and how we look on people, and it's reflected in our dolls. This is a doll that I had known for years and years and years, and some of you may recognize it or it may look a little familiar to you. This was Helene Sherman's. And what a wonderful woman Helene was, and after her death I was able to buy her doll. She has the wrong arms, and this is one of the dilemmas that happens. This doll has had replacement arms forever. I have the right arms, and I just can't bring myself to change them because she's been this way with replacement arms for so long, and that's how Helene knew and loved her. And
what was her name, Sally or something?
I don't know. I'm hoping she told me what it was, and it was a simple name. One of my favorite stories about a name for a doll, and I have seen the doll, one of the most expensive, most fabulous French dolls is a Brou, the same manufacturer of the wood-bodied lady doll, and it's Bébé Gourmand. You feed the doll, the food goes through a tube in its stomach and comes out an opening in the foot. This was an age of mechanism.
Anatomical aberration.
Her name was Dolly. She has the most awesome wardrobe of clothes, and everything is embroidered Dolly. But of course, she was French, and so maybe Dolly was exotic to them because that sounds better than poupée. By the time the child doll, and it didn't take long for the doll to, in the form of a child, to really take off. Well, the Germans were also big manufacturers of dolls, and they very quickly learned that whatever the French can do, we can do more of. And so they began to mass produce dolls. There wasn't the real care in a lot of them. It was much more mass production. But it brought the cost of a doll down so that more people could afford it. And of course, there was a greater demand. So the German mass production really met a need. People had more money to spend on luxuries. Children were important. Childhood was important. So bring the dolls to this country. And actually, she's a little bit out of place because she's a little later. The Germans, by the 1890s, the Germans really did have the market. But the Americans were trying to compete with this. That doll is particularly sentimental to me. My mother, who was born in 1904, never had a doll. And when I started buying and selling and collecting, when she came to the house, I was showing her my most recent, one I was most pleased with, and it was a staid-looking French, a little bit more stolid. It might have been, I don't remember what it was, but I was very pleased with it. And my mother went right over to this doll, and she said, "It's so beautiful, it's so beautiful." And she picked it up and she just held it, and I realized this doll dates from about 1910, just when my mother would have been a child. Even though her family couldn't afford a doll, she never had a doll. That is, in her mind, the ideal doll. Well, you know what my mother got for Christmas that year.
Well, I have to show them the picture, too.
Yeah, you have to show the picture. This is a mechanical piece that was done for the centennial 1876, the daughters of the, 1875?
1876.
76?
Yeah. Daughter of the regiment.
And it was a mechanical piece. There was a lot of interest in mechanical dolls and mechanism, particularly in the New England area. We had a lot of clockmakers out of Connecticut, and it's very easy to modify the clock mechanisms to dolls, to make them, in this case it would have been in a little drum, and to make the mechanism move. Other clock mechanisms were incorporated in dolls as toys, and you'll find a lot of toys that are clockwork operated, but this mechanism was then taken and used in dolls. Now, every generation and every country has claimed ownership to the first of this, but one of the first in France was Jules Steiner, the man that I wrote the first book about, the dolls of Steiner, that I had gotten so intrigued with. And that's the mechanism, and it's very much clockwork, and you're welcome to thumb through these books afterwards. The mechanism of a Steiner doll is completely that of the mechanism of a clock. Jules Steiner was a clockmaker. When he patented his first mechanisms, they were all of the same materials that were in his clocks. That was his training. But he was located in the quarter in France. He was located in the quarter in France that was the clockmakers' quarter, and also the toy makers. They were interrelated. There were a lot of mechanical pieces, automatons, and there was such crossover. Well, he came up with this idea of a body. Don't let her go yet.
Okay.
I wish we had the microphone, but
I don't think you need it with this one.
his mechanism was for Mama Papa speaking. That's, again, giving life to the dolls.
Yeah, you don't need it.
Not with her. I think she's going to be on.
And when you lay her down, she'll cry.
She cries. He's taken the same mechanism in a baby, this doll, and that's what he claimed the first baby doll. In a baby, the doll would be crying and with its arms outstretched, and you'd pick it up and it would go, Mama, Papa, and then you'd lay it down and it would cry again. He's just taken the same mechanism and put it in a body in the form of an adult. And so it's a little bit odd that it rolls around, waving its arms, dancing, crying, Mama, Papa, but it's intriguing. It's the next phase we have an American version of a walking lady, the Autoperipateticos, kind of German name.
No, it's Greek.
Greek? Yeah, you're right, I'm sorry, Greek, which means walks.
Whoa, did you hear that? Say it again.
I'm going to write it on the calendar, don't. Every time I say I'm right, I have to put it on the calendar. She has a great big key and great big feet, and she actually just sort of shuffles along. Again, you'll see the cardboard base in order to house the mechanism. And these were all made in this country, patented actually in several countries. And this particular form is often dressed as a man, a zouave, a woman. You'll find it with papier-mâché heads, china. This is called Parian, where it's unglazed but very white-toned. A lot of times very fancy heads used on this. One of the Germans, I was saying that a lot of German immigrants settled in Philadelphia, and there must be 40 or 50 known doll makers registered. In fact, there was a big exhibit at a national convention about 4 years ago with German doll manufacturers only. Pam, were you at that one? No. It was really, really neat. Follow-up, I guess it was about 3 years ago. And there have been a number of people in that area currently researching the lesser-known Philadelphia or Pennsylvania manufacturers, a very, very fertile area. But one of the best known is Schoenhardt. He first began making toy pianos in 18... Oh, you know what I didn't have is Joel Ellis. I don't have an example in my collection, but Joel Ellis in 1873 patented a wood articulated doll.
You can keep that on that side.
Mortise and tenon joints, not the spring strung that this is. This one is harder, Jerome, to see. Well, yeah, you can pass it around. This was a real child's play doll. It was advertised as being able to take any position. It can stand on its head. It can kneel. And someone else brought one in. I think it's up over. It may be up over on the table. But again, there it is in the dress with a little plastic bag. She can't breathe too well. She's a Schoenhardt dolly doll. She has molded open mouth with teeth, and she's made to look like the German doll that Jerome showed you that was my mother's doll. No, she has it, Jerome. The woman yeah, she has it here. She's a Schoenhardt. A lot of the Schoenhardt dolls were modeled, they were from the same time period in the early 20th century where there was an interest in realism in dolls, a movement toward art and the psychology of the time that a child should have a doll that more looked like the child, reflecting human emotions. So you'll find pouty or angry or crying or very happy, but more expression rather than the bland dolly face. But the dolly face had been popular for 20 or 30 years, and so Schoenhut saw a need also to duplicate that look with his wooden dolls. These dolls are all wood. The heads are pressed in molds, and the joints, the limbs are all tooled and spring-strung. I had referred to Joel Ellis earlier, and I will have these pages up here. I think this one I can send around. There are two patents that are drawn. I can't go any further. My tether won't let me. There are two patents on those pages. One is of a Joel Ellis that's all wood from 1873, and the other is from, I believe, 83 or 84, a woman who had done a patent in cloth, and it's equally well jointed. But here, a thing that I had done in the book was talk about gender trends, the patents that men tended to use the materials that they were familiar with, the metals, the leather, the materials that they used in their work. One of the leather dolls was made by a man who manufactured pulleys for machinery. Belts. I'm sorry, yeah, belts. And he came up with the idea, oh, why not use the scraps for doll heads? Well, he probably had a child, and maybe that child had been hurt by a broken bisque doll, and the interest in making dolls out of materials that were safer. And so that was his material that he was familiar with, so it was the material of choice, and he took a patent for leatherhead. Wood, of course, is very much a man's working material, where cloth is the material of women. Women who had had all that training in the needle arts.
Don't forget the rubber.
Oh, right. You would hardly know.
Fragile, I don't want to.
Yeah, that's... Charles Goodyear invented or discovered rubber kind of by accident when some dripped on a hot stove and vulcanized, and he learned that heat was the necessary ingredient to enable rubber to harden. And that's basically vulcanization from the fire god. And so, wow, now we have a material that can be poured into molds and made into all kinds of things, including doll heads. There isn't a material known to man that somebody hasn't made into a doll. Now, some of you may be looking at a Scotsman up there. And yes, indeed, Jerome, can you hold him carefully?
Carefully.
He's a lobster claw. And there actually is an article from about 1870 in one of the women's magazines with the instructions on making this. This to me is proof positive that women were getting to have too much free time on their hands. Sewing machine had really freed them up. I love him. I think he's great. He's actually a little bit later, and he did come out of a little firm, I think, in Medford, Massachusetts. Years later, some prettier dolls came out of Medford. By the early 20th century, we're seeing artists' dolls, artists' work represented in doll form. There gosh, so many of them, Rose O'Neill and the Cupies, a lot of women artists. This is a little later. This is Maud Tuesey Fangle, and if you want to hold that up, and there's a page from my book. The museum did use one of her drawings as a background with the photo, with the doll, which I thought was nice of them. I had asked them to. I was sure they would have a picture that they could do that with. A lot of the companies by the 20th century were being headed by women. We have Madame Alexander, Chase. Martha Chase actually was working at home, And I had a picture of Isana Walker. I was hoping an Isana Walker would walk through here. Two women who are most noted for cloth dolls. Isana Walker started probably as early as the late 1840s, but by it was 1873 that she patented her plan for a doll. And basically it was a layer of padding between the last two layers to impart a little softness and a feeling of skin like touching a peach, you know, just that little bit of softness from that. Martha Chase was much more progressive woman. She was the wife of a physician and the daughter of a physician, and very aware of the importance of cleanliness. And so for her, the doll needed to be washable. And so there's a lot of paint on there, and I'm sure it could go through several generations of children scrubbing its face and hands very, very carefully. And Isana Walker doll was much more a piece of artwork in 3-dimension. She was not as aware or concerned about her dolls being washed. She probably, in fact, I think that the very softness, that layer of padding, is what has caused the dolls to flake over time. Every so often one will appear that hasn't been exposed to temperature changes, and the paint will be intact. And it's so strange to see because Isanas usually are so worn and a little bit crazed. It's part of how they almost should be. But Martha Chase dolls do come along in really excellent condition, like the one that Jerome just had. Did you have the Chase out with the? Okay. That one, very, very heavy. So again, you have two women working at home with dolls that become somewhat mass-produced. They become known as the doll person of their town. This still happens today. There are people who make dolls, and other people hear about it, and they say, would you make one for my child? Well, maybe not as much today, but in Martha Chase's case, she was making these for her children, but she did go to Boston to a store, and they said they were so intrigued by it, and they ordered dolls, and the next thing you know, she had a little shop behind her house in Rhode Island called the Doll House, and it was really nice. The people worked there, and it was a very congenial and comfortable place to work. It was a nice little small industry, and yet it was the beginnings of a real industry that in her family continued for up until what?
35 years.
Oh, more than that. It didn't disband until the 60s or 70s. They were actually still making the dolls in vinyl in the 60s. But these dolls, Dr. Taub may remember seeing a Chase Hospital doll that the doctors, life-size, I don't know. I have heard that they had genitals that could be snapped on and off. They had openings. And they did also have baby dolls for the nurses to teach the mothers how to care for their children. And they were weighted to be about 7 pounds, the weight of a baby. So in addition to making the play dolls, there was very much the hospital doll aspect of the business. So what started out as just a mother making comfortable, safe dolls for her children becomes a full-blown business and stayed in the family for years. By the 20th century,
I think we lost the showing up somewhere in here. My fist up.
no, it's over there.
Going that way.
By the 20th century, the material that America came up with, because we were importing most of our dolls, was composition. And I really had expected to see a lot more composition dolls come in here because these are the ones that are still in people's families. And I tend not to have composition dolls in my collection. I tend to like the 19th century. The composition industry is where America took off. We had all of the the forests, we had the raw materials, we had the hide, the glue factory, we had all of the crud to go into making composition. And you didn't need the big kilns, the big porcelain manufactories. It could be done, had to have been very, very smelly. But it could be done in molds, like they have gang molds, and they would pour the heads and press them together. And the composition industry developed from as early as 1870. People were playing around with it. Could you show the Emma Bristol? Because that's technically early composition, and you'll see it has almost a wood-like feel.
It's an extremely rare doll. There isn't much of it left, but it's the only example we've ever owned.
It's very, very heavy composition.
It's almost like
You can-
masonite,
Right. Yeah, today's materials, building materials, wood pulps are very similar to this. Very, very heavy composition. The composition of typical of dolls is a much lighter weight composition, and that obviously the weight of this was a deterrent. And so they did learn to make composition lighter and durable. And it wasn't breakable like the bisque dolls were. So this is where the American industry really took off, and it was in 1910 that the tide turned from more dolls being made at home than imported.
Okay.
Playthings is a magazine that's been,
Are you done with it?
yeah. Playthings is a trade magazine, and they recorded in 1910 that more dolls were made. It was shortly after that, with World War I, also, that we didn't want to be importing dolls. We did get an influx of some Japanese dolls, but by then the American industry was pretty well established. We then had cloth dolls being made, Madame Alexander, Georgine Novelties, and Raggedy Ann. Now there is a Raggedy Ann that was brought in, a nice early one.
A couple of that.
Yeah, could you show us your Raggedy? And I'm glad Pam is here. A few years ago, some of you may have seen a wonderful exhibit of Raggedy Ann dolls at the Concord Museum at Christmas time. There's a picture of that in my book, unfortunately only in black and white, and Raggedy Ann really needs to be in color. But she is one of the early ones, and she does have her patent date. Johnny Gruelle, again another man, writing stories for his daughter Marcella. Now there may have been another cloth doll in the family years earlier, and he remembered that, and it could have been. Wouldn't that be something? Would have been the right time frame. But he remembered a rag doll, and so he drew pictures to entertain his daughter who was ill, and began to do stories about little Raggedy Ann and Andy. And then out came the doll, and then the next thing you know, let's make a doll like it. And Raggedy Ann has been a part of American culture for 85 years through several manufacturers. And very early on, she got her pal, Andy. And very much an important part of American culture, both story and doll form. Oh, yeah. We did try in America to compete with the Germans. This particular German business, remember the one that you saw that I had given to my mother, was German, about 1910. But in America, this doll in the white, Jerome, looking at her face, you would swear she were a German doll. She was made by James Shawley Taft in New Hampshire. Now, he obviously brought with him materials and skills that he had learned in his native country. Sometimes when the Americans played around with bisque, they forgot things like the eyes. Oh yeah, we get them from Germany, and we're not importing. And so there are a number of unpainted, unfinished heads from the Paul Revere pottery company because no eyes. And, oh yeah, we don't really have the skill to paint this. I do know how to mix this stuff up, and oh, gee whiz, this is not quite what it cracked up to. I think I'll try another material. And so the American bisque industry was very limited. There's Fulper, there was Reinhardt out of New Jersey, but again, he brought his German skills, probably the very materials, the kaolin pastes and all from Germany, the eyes. In the papier-mâché dolls from decades earlier in the 1850s and 60s, you'll find a lot of glass-eyed examples. And then we get even Greiner, who did the first patent that was for a doll, the manufacturing of a doll head. His end up first with glass eyes and then later with painted, because his supply of eyes was gone and he couldn't get them. It just wasn't cost effective, so bang, painted eyes. So the earlier glass eyes, in that case, are rarer. What else do we have here? I think we're...
Shirley.
I don't want to keep you people too long. There's, these two dolls are examples of composition. I really expected a good Shirley Temple to come walking in here, because this is the doll that's still, you had one and you were going to bring it?
I didn't even think of bringing it, but I have one.
Every time I've done a talk, a Shirley Temple comes in, so.
That's a Shirley.
But this one is an unusual Shirley. This is Shirley from the movie The Hurricane. She was Marama in the movie The Hurricane, and it is the Shirley mold, but she doesn't have the moving tin eye. She has painted eyes, and really kind of a neat expression.
This is cute.
I think he's a little later. He's the 60s. So we want to go to MacArthur.
Okay.
1940s is, of course, the war, and everything reflected the war. Toys and dolls particularly, very significant. You'll find every element, paper dolls dramatically so, but you will find...
It's not a doll, it's an action figure.
Okay, General MacArthur. And these were from the Freundlich Manufacturing Company, which is Massachusetts? I think so. And that obviously is General MacArthur, the man of the hour.
You have a kind word for Barbie?
I have a lot of kind words for Barbie. We do have a little composition. Native American on her cradle board. So we have a manufactured composition doll reflecting the importance of the Native American culture, 1910, 1920. We have, oh, this is one of my favorites. Forgot about this. This is turn of the century. And this, I still have this nagging doubt. The patent for this is Gussie Decker. I'm not 100% sure that Gussie wasn't a man and not a woman. I don't know. There's just, maybe it is a woman's doll, but... Augustus, yeah. I just am not sure. It's always been listed as G.D. Decker or Gussie, signed Gussie D. But it's made of leather. It laces up with like shoelacing. There was one I saw recently, very mint, that had the name Irma. What's it called when you... Stencil? Well, it was more like burnt in. When they branded, almost like branded in. This one has no trace of a name. But you can see why these would not have survived. Have you ever seen a dog toy more like a Chewy? But they're rare, and yet they were advertised in Sears for pennies, 50 cents or 10 for $1 or whatever. Very, very inexpensive. But chewable, safe, and probably after the baby and the dog finished with it, out it went. So they're kind of a neat doll. From composition, we've made it through the china and the bisque and the ladies. I don't know if I said clearly how the form of the doll had evolved from the lady form, which you see at the early paper maches and the very, very lady form. The china doll as a lady. Sometimes you'll see it dressed as a baby, but it's still very much the form of a lady. Long, slender body, very much the form, even the face. It's just the clothing that differentiates it as a baby. It lies in a cradle that long, because it's an adult form. To a toddler down to infant. The evolution of the doll is backward from human growth and development. The materials go from the china through everything, but the main manufactured materials, china, bisque, paper mache, into the compositions, and then we have hard plastic, and then vinyl. And it was with vinyl, it's hard to imagine to sit back and say, oh my God, vinyl, plastic's been around 60 years now. And that's as long as bisque was popular. So the vinyl and plastic dolls of today really are rooted. They are, and it is a perfect material for a child's plaything. It's a perfect material even for artists to work in after they've made their original mold, because you can get so much definition. This doll is hard plastic on the head and a soft the vinyl. So it's a combination of the two, and collectors really do value the hard plastic. It's a shorter lifespan that it was made from the 40s into the early or mid 50s. By then we're much more into the vinyl. And there's a, because it was made, anything that's made for a short period of time is on the collector's market going to have more demand because fewer were made. This particular doll, it was old when my daughter had it, but it was hers, and she loved playing with it because it is so posable. The ankle moves, it's quite like the brew actually in plastic. The ankle, it totally articulates, and it's in the form of a ballet dancer. And what little girl hasn't dreamed of growing up to be a ballet dancer? Ballet dancers and brides, the dream of the young girl, right? And so earlier today, the lady had to leave. She came in with 2 bride dolls. Ballerina dolls, and these photographed in the book. I did add a few pictures of mine on my daughter's very toe shoes. All those years of ballet, and she wanted so much to get up on toe. And once she did, she found out it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It hurt. So we have a very, very rarely used, almost pristine pair of shoes, and a kind of worn little doll, very sentimental. And that's really a lot of what the whole doll thing is about. So much love is put on these dolls by the children who played with them. They are the first place that a child puts love. There's the love between a parent and a child. But the first time the child takes that love outward, it's not to somebody else, it's to a doll. It's the mothering, the nurturing to their doll. And it's really the first time oftentimes they go outside themselves. It's a continuation of the love they have felt from their parent reflected in the doll, reflected to the doll. And so the doll picks up so much of the emotion that has been given to it. And for me, that's part of the appeal of the dolls, probably part of why I collect them. They say so much about the people who have owned them. Those of you who have dolls should write down everything about the person who first owned them, because that's called provenance, and that's really very important. It's very significant, because perhaps more than any other antiques, the childhood antiques really reflect the person at a very, very important part of their life, the growing, the early years. Now I know there are other dolls here. Oh, Jerome wanted me to show you. This is a little boy from Western Union got into the doll thing, and this is Have a Happy Day. So little dolls were sent out. We have Ginny's. Ginny was wonderful with all her clothes, and I have a Ginny up here in the box that you're welcome to look at. Very rare to find it still with its wardrobe in this little trunk. And then a later plastic version. Ginny was made by different manufacturers, and this one, I forget where this came from. It's not one of the real desirable ones, but it's cute because it's in a sailor suit. And then we have Barbie. Now, there's a Barbie from the book, and they had an exhibit called When Barbie Dated G.I. Joe. And as you can see, when they dated, they went out on his motorcycle. But later on, when Barbie grew up, she became an Air Force captain and flew her own plane. Barbie has held every job known to man or woman in this country. Barbie was the first woman to run for president. Barbie, you know, if archaeologists came back and had only Barbie, they'd have a pretty good idea of what went on in this country. The French, curiously, the French who were so intrigued by costume and set the standard in the 19th century, love Barbie. They are absolutely mad for her, for all her costumes, because they respect costuming in this country and worldwide, and how because to them costume is very significant. So Barbie is really a very important part of today's life. The Cabbage Patch dolls are still important. Kids love them. I've always enjoyed seeing, well, I guess there's not as much with it, but I did enjoy seeing kids playing with them because it was what dolls are meant to be. There's a whole field of artist dolls, and there's one here that I'd like you to see again, the Annette Himstead. Tell them what you told me when you saw him. It's so.
Well, I like to go with Daniel Schwartz when I'm in town, and I was on the yard in Boston, I just happened to go in and look around, and I saw the doll on this top shelf of 3 shelves. I asked the sales lady if I could see it. She said, "Would you like me to take it down?" I said, "Sure." And so I got him. And I own 2 dolls, and this is one of them.
Yeah, that is the appeal on an adult level. Maybe he looks like somebody. It's just that appeal. These are reflections of human life, reflections of emotion, both the emotion you feel and the emotion that they reflect. There's a whole.
No, the costume is, yeah.
The costume is Turanian, and the doll was my grandmother's.
You brought a lot of dolls in. I really appreciate it. There's been a very great interest in the last 10 years on dolls in regional costumes. There's a book, World Colors, by a girl who had been the curator at the Rosalie Weil Museum. Wait a minute, Jerome. Wait a minute. On the provincial costumes, they have actually been able to identify some of the costumes that the people, they no longer wear through the dolls that have survived. So it has worked both ways. It has helped costuming and researchers on the adult level. Also with a pair of Cree dolls, the male Cree costume, there was no representation of it. And again, the Rosalie Weil Museum had a pair, and the Cree Indian Society, or whatever, the Cree Native Canadian Society, I don't know, the Cree Indians, they're Canadian Indians. Are they Native Canadians? The Cree research group were very, very interested in this pair of Cree dolls because they had no representation of the male costume. And so from the dolls, they were able to document it. The same with early English woodens. Fabulous costuming on the dolls has documented what people were actually wearing at the time, in addition to the conventions that people had to go through with hair piled up high on frames. And oh gosh, there's just so many things that dolls represent. I could be here all day, but I don't think they're sending pizza in for us. What else do we have over there?
Oh, we've got a nice old Perry and Red Riding Hood.
Oh, isn't she wonderful?
Actually, she's kind of a combination. Her face is the Perry best, but her hair has been glazed, which is kind
Red Riding Hood is a theme.
Costume.
Oh, here's a composition baby.
And
This,
there aren't any other babies.
no, because I always get babies come in.
Maybe that's because I was always told, of course, that rather than being made in Pennsylvania or New Jersey or Connecticut, she was made at the North Pole.
Oh, Santa Claus. This looks like Bubbles or one of the American-made composition dolls. They always come in, you know, I was careful not to bring things, and a couple of examples that I had are pretty shabby compared to what usually comes in. So this is wonderful. This is the classic play doll of the 30s and 40s. My own doll of childhood was a composition baby doll.
Before that. And before that.
20s. But the form of the baby doll, the mama doll, well, actually the mama doll usually has swing legs so the child could walk it. But the form of the baby doll, by the 1920s, that was curious. When you think of the 20s, the roaring 20s, all the craziness, all the sophistication, the wildness of the time, and yet the doll was the baby doll. So you have a real juxtaposition of elements, both, yeah, huh?
Swinging.
Yeah, really. The return to family values and so much of life counter to that, to the family and to simple values. So it's kind of, to me, that's kind of neat. During the 20s, that was an anything goes period, even in the doll world. But you do see a lot of little carnival type things that we called cute dolls. But the baby doll is a real staple. I'm really glad you brought it. In the early periods with the chinas, the hair was molded in as part of the doll. And the Parian that Jerome just showed you, the Alice in Wonderland, the Red Riding Hood, you do find she has molded hair in a hairstyle of the period. And that's one of the ways that we can date a doll, is by the hairstyle of the molded hair. Because sometimes the same material is used over a long period of time. So in a china doll that could have been made anywhere from 1820 to 1870, the hairstyle will tell us if it's a flattened, Civil War period, or pulled back, or fancy curls down. They look just like the children and the people of the period. The French dolls, when we get into the lady doll in the polka dots, her hair is natural, so-called natural. It's mohair from the goats, and they comb it and weave it and make it into mohair. Strands and, all curled up. So mohair was a material used. Human hair also. And then the synthetics, the mohair was still used with the Schoenhutts, and then we find by the middle of this century the synthetic hairs, and of course with the vinyl dolls the hair is rooted in the Puig medical transplant group. So the materials of the period get used in the dolls of the period. In some cases, we have replaced it. The Steiner in the brown dress, she's open. I had the book open to a page. She has lever eyes. That was one of Steiner's patents, to open and close the eyes. He was very much an inventor, and her hair is human hair, and that was one of Jerome's children's hair. When I first started into dolls, people would bring me hair, and because I was going to, you can do anything, right? I'll make wigs, and we all try this, right? And this is tedious. And that's it. That was the one wig I made. Somebody for a while was making them, and I did send hair off. Usually human hair wig does not translate. If it's fine enough to work on a doll, it's really too fine to work with, unless you're in some factory over there. So we, by the Sarans and the later dolls, the vinyl dolls, the hair is more a Saran or a nylon.
Hallmark they do?
Oh, there was a wonderful Hallmark came out with the Historical Society. You know, a lot of history has been taught through dolls. There was a beautiful Kessner bisque that he,
Name the company.
that's a German manufacturer. Kessner was one of the, probably Simon Halbig and Kessner were the two premier manufacturers in Germany of dolls.
Little combo thing.
Wonderful.
I don't know what they are.
Okay, they're wonderful. That the interest in foreign costume in a book that probably the library should have is this World Colors, because it does teach so much about dolls all over the world and how they reflect the people's. And it's neat too because it has a lot of postcards and photographs of people in the actual costumes in conjunction with the dolls. And so it really is very strongly educational. There have been a lot of efforts at education, teaching American history through dolls through the years. The F&B company did it in the 30s with a series of historical dolls representing all eras, and we're having it again with the American Girl dolls. These, while initially I was a little bit, they're so expensive and they're really out of the reach of a lot of people. And it has had, I don't know if it's still as strong, but when they first came out, it was very much a competitive thing with the girls, and there was ostracism if you didn't have it. And not everybody can afford $100 for a doll, and then the $50 for this, and the $75 for that. And before you know it, that doll's $1,000 with all its accoutrements. And I am offended by that. Dolls are meant to be played with, and if a person can't really afford it, I've seen children ostracized because they can't, or they get the doll and don't get the other things. They have these tea parties and gatherings, and I've heard of kids who felt out of it because they didn't have the stuff to go. And that takes away to me some of the value, the good of the doll. And the doll is basically a good toy, but it's very well marketed, it's very well produced, the books are wonderful, they do teach a lot about American history, and I do acknowledge them in the book that I did for the Strong Museum, A Celebration of American Dolls, because they are significant and the research is excellent. We did get one of the grandchildren one, but we didn't follow through to buy all the stuff, and it was one of her friends who couldn't afford it and was upset by it, you know, and I thought, what am I fostering by doing this? I'm the doll lady, but I don't know, I just have mixed feelings about it. It's a good product, and I think that the books are better than the doll and all the stuff.